In the winter of 1987, the small town of Arlington, Washington, was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked at night. Nestled into the glacial hills above the Snohomish River, surrounded by thick stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar, it was a town where the timber industry had once been everything, and where the future was still something people argued about over coffee at the local diner. The population hovered around 5,000. Most folks knew each other by name, and the worst trouble anyone expected was a teenager driving too fast on a rain-slicked back road. December had settled over the Pacific Northwest like a damp gray blanket. The sun barely cleared the Cascades before it was dropping behind the Olympics again, and the days were short, dark things hemmed in by clouds that never seemed to lift. Rain came sideways off the Puget Sound, and the air held the sharp, clean scent of wet evergreen and cold earth. Temperatures hovered in the low 40s during the day and dropped to freezing at night. By 4 in the afternoon, the streetlights were already on along Olympic Avenue, and the roads beyond the edge of town disappeared into a darkness that felt absolute. Arlington was the kind of town where everybody waved from their car, where the high school football games drew half the population on a Friday night, where the grocery store clerk knew your mother's maiden name, and the volunteer fire department held a pancake breakfast every month that smelled like maple syrup and community. It was safe. Or at least it felt safe. And in a place like that, the distinction between feeling safe and being safe is one that most people never have reason to examine. It was in this small, quiet world that 17-year-old Evelyn Mae Chandler lived her life. By all accounts, she was a young woman on the cusp of everything. 17. Old enough to hold down a job, young enough to believe the world was a fundamentally safe place. She had the kind of energy and optimism that belongs to people who have not yet been given a reason to be afraid. She worked in town, like a lot of teenagers in Arlington did, earning her own money, building the kind of independence that comes with a first paycheck and the freedom to walk yourself home after a shift. And that is what Evelyn was doing on a cold December evening in 1987. She was walking home from work. It was a routine she had followed before. A path through the small town streets, and maybe along the shoulder of a quiet road that led back to the life she knew. A normal evening, a normal walk. The kind of thing a 17-year-old does without a second thought. But Evelyn Mae Chandler never made it home. Somewhere between her workplace and her front door, between one streetlight and the next, between the world she knew and the world she would never see again, something happened. The details of those final minutes belonged to the darkness, and for more than 3 decades, that is exactly where they would remain. When she failed to arrive, alarms set in quickly. In a town like Arlington, where everyone was accounted for and distance was measured in minutes, not miles, a missing teenager was not something that went unnoticed. Her family raised the alarm. Neighbors were called. Concern turned to dread as the hours stretched into the night, and there was no sign of her. In the days that followed, search parties fanned out across the area. Volunteers walked the fields and the tree lines. They followed the roads she might have taken, and the ones she would not have. They called her name into the wet December wind. They checked with friends and businesses and anyone who might have seen her. Every hour that passed without word made the weight heavier, because people in Arlington knew their geography. They knew that beyond the streetlights and the sidewalks, beyond the last row of houses, the land turned wild. Thick forests, river ravines, miles and miles of timber country where a person could disappear and the earth would simply close over the absence. 5 days after Evelyn vanished, the search came to its terrible conclusion. Her body was found in a wooded area outside of town. The scene told a story that no one in Arlington wanted to hear. There were signs of a violent assault, and the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Evelyn Mae Chandler, 17 years old, had been attacked, violated, and murdered. Her body left in the woods like something discarded and forgotten. The effect on the community was seismic. Arlington in 1987 was not a place accustomed to this kind of violence. This was a town where the biggest news was usually a school board meeting or a new shop opening on the main street. The murder of a teenage girl, the sheer brutality of what had been done to her, shattered something in the collective psyche of the community. Parents held their children closer. Doors that had been left unlocked were bolted. People looked at their neighbors differently, because the unspoken question hung over everything. Who among us did this? The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office launched a full-scale investigation. In those first days, there was an urgency that bordered on desperation. This was not a big city homicide division accustomed to processing a murder every week. This was a community in shock, and the detectives assigned to the case carried the weight of that shock with them. They processed the scene where Evelyn's body had been found. They collected physical evidence. They conducted interviews, canvassed the area, and began the painstaking work of building a timeline. In 1987, the tools available to investigators were fundamentally different from what we take for granted today. There was no widespread DNA database. There were no cell phone records to trace, no surveillance cameras on every corner. What detectives had were shoe leather, witness statements, physical evidence, and instinct. They worked the case hard. Every lead was followed. Every tip was run down. But the case did not break. There is a particular kind of silence that descends on an investigation when the leads run dry. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of something unfinished, something rotting quietly beneath the surface. Detectives know it well. It is the sound of a case going cold. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The investigation continued, but without a suspect, without a confession, without a witness who could place someone with Evelyn on the night she disappeared. The case slowly cooled. Files thickened with dead ends and abandoned leads. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning retired or moved on. New investigators inherited the binders and the photographs and the weight of an unsolved murder. And through it all, the family of Evelyn Mae Chandler waited. This is the cruelty of an unsolved murder that is difficult to convey to anyone who has not lived it. It is not just grief. Grief, as devastating as it is, follows a trajectory. There is a loss, and there is a slow, agonizing process of learning to carry it. But when a murder goes unsolved, the grief is compounded by something else entirely. There is no resolution, no accountability, no answer to the question that burns in the back of your mind every single day. Who did this to her? For Evelyn's family, that question went unanswered for more than 30 years. Imagine that. Imagine waking up every morning for 11,000 days and knowing that the person who killed your child is somewhere out there living a life, maybe eating breakfast, maybe watching television, maybe walking down a street in a town just like yours, and you do not know their name. You do not know their face. You only know what they took from you. That was the reality for Evelyn's family. Year after year, decade after decade. In Arlington, life went on. The town grew. The population swelled as Seattle's suburbs pushed north. New housing developments replaced the old timber lots. By the 2000s, Arlington had transformed from a quiet mill town into a commuter community of more than 15,000 people. The world had changed. The internet had come. Cell phones were everywhere. And in the field of forensic science, a revolution was quietly underway that would reach back through the decades and touch cases that everyone had given up on. That revolution was genetic genealogy. To understand what happened next in the Chandler case, you have to understand how profoundly genetic genealogy changed the landscape of criminal investigation. For decades, DNA evidence was only useful if investigators had a suspect to compare it to. You could collect biological evidence from a crime scene, develop a DNA profile, and then, if you arrested someone, you could check whether their DNA matched. But if you had no suspect, the profile just sat in a database, waiting. The breakthrough came in 2018. When investigators in California used a public genealogy website called GE Match to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo had eluded capture for more than 40 years. His case had been one of the most infamous unsolved crime sprees in American history. And yet, a genealogist working with law enforcement was able to identify him in a matter of days by uploading crime scene DNA to a public database and tracing the genetic connections through family trees. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Millions of people had voluntarily uploaded their DNA profiles to sites like GE Match, Ancestry, and 23andMe, searching for long-lost relatives and building family trees. When crime scene DNA was uploaded to GD Match, the system could identify genetic relatives of the unknown suspect, even distant cousins. Genealogists would then build out the family trees of those matches, working backward and forward through generations, cross-referencing public records, until they narrowed the field to a handful of individuals who fit the geographic and demographic profile of the unknown offender. It was, in the words of one investigator, the biggest crime-fighting breakthrough in decades. The arrest of the Golden State Killer opened the floodgates. Cold case units across the country began submitting decades-old DNA evidence for genetic genealogy analysis. And Snohomish County, where Evelyn Mae Chandler had been murdered, was at the very forefront of this movement. In fact, just months after the Golden State Killer arrest, Snohomish County made history of its own. In May of 2018, investigators arrested William Earl Talbot II for the 1987 murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg, a young Canadian couple whose case had gone cold for 31 years. Talbot's conviction in 2019 was the first ever trial and conviction in a case solved through genetic genealogy. And it happened right there in Snohomish County. The message was clear: no cold case was beyond reach, not anymore. And so, in 2019, detectives turned their attention back to the murder of Evelyn Mae Chandler. The DNA evidence collected from the crime scene in 1987 had been preserved. It had been waiting all those years for the science to catch up, and now it had. Investigators submitted the crime scene DNA for genetic genealogy analysis. The profile was uploaded to a genealogical database, and the painstaking work of tracing family connections began. Genealogists identified genetic relatives of the unknown offender. They built family trees. They cross-referenced records and locations, and step by step, the web of connections tightened around a single individual. His name was Ronald Keith Malloy. Think about that for a moment. A name. After 32 years of silence, after 3 decades of a family wondering, and a community haunted by the unknown, the answer came down to a name on a screen, a match in a database. A line connecting one person's DNA to the evidence left at a crime scene in the woods outside Arlington, Washington in December of 1987. When detectives identified Malloy, they discovered something that deepened the horror of the case. Malloy was not some unknown figure who had drifted through Arlington unnoticed. He had a documented history of violent criminal offenses. He had been in the Arlington area at the time of Evelyn's murder. And at the time investigators identified him in 2019, he was already incarcerated on separate, unrelated charges. This was a violent man, a man with a pattern. And for more than 30 years, the connection between Ronald Keith Malloy and the murder of Evelyn Mae Chandler had remained hidden, buried in the limitations of the technology that existed at the time of the crime. In 2019, Ronald Keith Malloy was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree rape in connection with the death of Evelyn Mae Chandler. 32 years. That is how long Evelyn's family had waited. 32 years of holidays without her. 32 years of birthdays that never came. 32 years of not knowing who had taken their daughter, their sister, their Evelyn, and left her in the woods outside a town that was supposed to be safe. The arrest did not bring Evelyn back. Nothing could. But it brought something that the family had been denied for more than 3 decades. It brought answers. It brought accountability. It brought the knowledge that the person responsible had been identified, that the system had not forgotten Evelyn Mae Chandler, that somewhere in a crime lab and a detective's office and a genealogist's spreadsheet, her case had remained alive, even when the world had moved on. There is something worth reflecting on here, something that goes beyond the facts of this particular case. Across the United States, there are tens of thousands of unsolved murders, tens of thousands of families living in that same limbo, carrying that same unanswered question. And for decades, many of those cases seemed genuinely hopeless. The evidence existed, but the technology to decode it did not. Genetic genealogy has changed that equation. Since 2018, more than 600 cases have been solved using this technique. Old cases going back to the 1960s and 70s have been cracked open. Victims who had never even been identified, whose names had been lost for decades, have been given back their identities. And killers who believed they had gotten away with it, who had lived their lives for 20, 30, 40 years in the comfort of anonymity, have been pulled from the shadows and held to account. Snohomish County, where Evelyn lived and died, became something of a proving ground for this technology. The Talbot case. The Jody Loomis case, a 1972 murder solved through genetic genealogy in 2019 when investigators matched DNA to a 77-year-old man named Terrence Miller after retrieving his discarded coffee cup from a casino garbage can. And the Chandler case. 3 cold cases, spanning decades, all solved through the same scientific revolution. But even as we acknowledge the power of this technology, it is worth pausing to consider what was lost in the years before it existed. Evelyn Mae Chandler was 17 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was walking home from work on a December evening in a town where everyone felt safe. And someone took all of that away from her. For 32 years, the person who did it walked free. He lived his life. He breathed air that Evelyn never got to breathe. He saw sunrises she never got to see. The asymmetry of that, the fundamental injustice of it, is staggering. And while the arrest and charges brought a measure of justice, they could not undo the decades of silence that came before. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of time and justice. We want to believe that justice is swift, that the system works, that the guilty are caught, and the innocent are protected. But the reality is messier and more painful than that. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the guilty walk free for decades. And sometimes it takes a revolution in science to deliver the accountability that should have come in weeks instead of years. The story of Evelyn Mae Chandler is, in the end, two stories. The first is a tragedy. A young woman, full of potential, murdered in a place that should have been safe by a man with violence written into his history. The second is a story about persistence, about detectives who never fully closed the file, about scientists who developed technologies that could reach across decades, about a family that never stopped hoping for answers. When you drive through Arlington today, it is a different place than it was in 1987. The town has grown. The old timber lots are neighborhoods now. The population is over 20,000. But the Stillaguamish River still winds through the valley below the bluffs. The Cascades still rise to the east, and the forests, those deep, dark Pacific Northwest forests, still press in close around the edges of town, as if to remind you that beneath the streetlights and the sidewalks, the wild is never far away. Evelyn Mae Chandler walked into that darkness on a December evening in 1987, and she never came back. But her name came back. Her story came back. And after 32 years of silence, so did justice. If you are someone living with the weight of an unsolved case, whether as a family member, a friend, or an investigator, know this: the science is still advancing. New techniques are being developed. New databases are growing. And every day, somewhere in this country, a cold case file is being pulled from a shelf, dusted off, and handed to someone with the tools that did not exist when it was first opened. The past is not as far away as it used to be. This has been the cold case of Evelyn Mae Chandler. If you found this story worth telling, consider sharing it with someone who cares about the cases that too often go forgotten. And remember, as long as the evidence survives, no case is ever truly cold.